Ethan Parker never intended to become a recluse. Once a celebrated wildlife photographer in the bustling heart of San Francisco, his life had been a whirlwind of gallery exhibitions, international assignments, and the unrelenting hum of city life. But the bright lights and endless noise had slowly chipped away at something deep within him, leaving an unshakable craving for silence. 5 years ago, he turned his back on all of it, trading skyscrapers for snow-capped peaks, crowded streets for a sprawling expanse of wilderness. Nestled in the remote Alaskan backcountry, miles from the nearest neighbor, he found something he hadn't realized he'd lost: himself. The transition had been anything but smooth. The wilderness, unforgiving and indifferent, tested him at every turn, hunting, trapping, splitting wood, enduring months of darkness. It all demanded a strength he hadn't known he possessed. Over time, his soft hands grew calloused, his once pristine camera exchanged for a rifle and a set of sturdy tools. Ethan thrived in the harsh solitude, finding solace in the rhythmic routines of survival. Each day began with purpose and ended in the quiet satisfaction of self-reliance. Yet in the stillness of the long Alaskan nights, a part of him remained restless, haunted by the echoes of the life he'd left behind. As the first whispers of an impending storm reached his cabin, Ethan didn't flinch. Winter storms were no stranger to this land, and he'd endured his fair share. But this one was different, stronger, fiercer, the kind of storm the old-timers would have swapped stories about for decades. Temperatures were already plunging below -40 degrees Fahrenheit, and the biting winds rattled the thick wooden walls of his cabin. He moved quickly, instinctively, reinforcing the shutters, stacking firewood, and double-checking his stores of dried meat and canned goods. It was a process he'd perfected over the years, an almost meditative preparation for the onslaught of nature's fury. Yet, as the first flakes of snow began to fall, a strange unease settled in his chest, an inexplicable weight that no amount of preparation could lift. Ethan knew how to survive storms. He'd weathered blizzards, gale-force winds, and bone-chilling cold. But something about this one felt different, ominous. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that this storm would be unlike any he'd faced before. It wouldn't just test his survival skills, it would strip him bare, forcing him to confront the frailty of his isolation and the depths of his own humanity. Late at night, as the storm reached a crescendo, Ethan sat by the crackling fire, the warmth from the flames barely keeping the relentless cold at bay. The wind howled like a feral creature outside, shaking the walls of his cabin with such force that he half expected the roof to lift clean off. He had spent the evening repairing a broken snowshoe and keeping his mind occupied. But even in the steady rhythm of his tasks, something felt off, a prickling sensation at the back of his neck, as though the wilderness were watching. Then he heard it. A faint guttural sound cut through the storm's roar. At first he thought it was the wind playing tricks on his ears, but then it came again, this time unmistakable. Low and mournful, the sound was unlike anything he had heard before. His hands froze mid-motion, the leather strap in his grip slipping through his fingers. Slowly, Ethan stood, heart pounding as he reached for the rifle prop near the door. Whatever it was close. Carefully, he unlatched the wooden shutters over one of the cabin's windows, just enough to peer into the swirling chaos of snow and wind outside. At first, he saw nothing, just a wall of white, snowflakes whipping past the glass in frenzied waves. But then movement caught his eye. Shapes, blurry and indistinct, lumbering through the storm. He narrowed his gaze, and his breath hitched as the forms came into focus. A mother bear and her 2 cubs. They were moving slowly, almost painfully, their silhouettes barely visible against the blizzard's fury. The mother was enormous, her fur caked with snow and ice, her body swaying with exhaustion. Behind her, the cubs stumbled and struggled, their small frames shivering violently. They were far too young, far too small, to be outside in the dead of winter. By now they should have been nestled deep in a den, hibernating, safe from the unforgiving cold. Ethan's stomach twisted. He had seen bears many times in his years as a wildlife photographer, had studied their behaviors and captured their majestic power through his lens. But this was different. These weren't the strong, confident creatures he remembered. The mother was desperate, and the cubs, one of them barely able to stand, were slowly succumbing to the cold. Instinctively, he tightened his grip on the rifle. Every rule of wilderness survival screamed at him to stay inside. Bears were unpredictable at the best of times, and in a storm like this, with starvation likely driving them, they could be deadly. He knew better than to intervene, knew that nature had its own rules, harsh as they were. This was simply the way of things, wasn't it? Survival of the fittest. And yet, he couldn't look away. The image of the cubs, their fragile bodies shivering uncontrollably, burned into his mind. It was more than the helplessness of their movements, or the way they huddled against their mother for warmth. It was the eyes of the mother bear that struck him. Even through the haze of the storm, Ethan could see the fear and determination in her gaze, the primal instinct to protect her young, to keep moving, no matter the cost. He felt a pang in his chest, an ache that stirred something he thought he had left behind. Memories surfaced unbidden, long days spent crouched in the brush, camera in hand, documenting wildlife from a distance. Back then, he had prided himself on his ability to remain an observer, to let nature take its course without interference. But this wasn't the same. Those cubs weren't just fighting the odds, they were losing. Ethan paced the cabin, the rifle still in his hands, his mind a battlefield of conflicting thoughts. He had spent years learning to survive in this wilderness, respecting its dangers and its unforgiving rules. To step outside, to approach those bears, would be reckless. And yet, the thought of sitting by the fire, warm and safe, while those cubs froze to death just a few yards away, it felt like a betrayal of everything human in him. His fingers hovered over the latch of the door. He glanced back at the fire, at the familiar safety of his cabin, and then back out the window at the struggling bears. The storm raged on, the wind screaming like a warning. He knew the risks. He knew that stepping into their world could mean disaster for all of them. But as the cubs collapsed into the snow, their tiny bodies barely moving, Ethan felt his resolve crack. Could he live with himself if he did nothing? Could he really let them die when he had the means to help? For the first time in years, Ethan questioned the lines he had drawn between himself and the wild. Maybe this storm wasn't just a test of survival. Maybe it was something more. With a deep breath, he made his decision. The door creaked open, and the cold hit him like a wall of ice. Rifle in hand and heart pounding, Ethan stepped into the storm. Ethan had always lived by a simple creed: respect the wilderness and it will respect you. But tonight, as he stared at the struggling bears outside his cabin, that creed felt hollow. The storm wasn't respecting anyone. Not the mother bear fighting to shield her cubs, not the shivering, helpless little ones clinging to her side. Ethan had spent years learning how to coexist with nature without interfering. But now, his instincts and his conscience were at war. He exhaled sharply, the fog of his breath merging with the frosty air inside the cabin. He knew what he had to do and he hated it. Every rule he'd ever followed screamed against the decision. Bears were dangerous, unpredictable. Intervening could spell disaster, for them and for him. But as his gaze fell on the cubs collapsing into the snow, their fragile bodies barely moving, he felt the weight of their suffering crush his hesitation. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, slamming the shutters closed. Ethan moved with purpose, his mind racing through a plan as he tore through his supplies. The small insulated storage room adjacent to his cabin, usually used to store extra firewood and food, was his best bet. It wasn't much, but it could shield the bears from the worst of the storm. He grabbed a stack of old blankets, a bundle of tarps, and the thickest rope he could find. His hands worked swiftly, preparing a makeshift bed in the storage room and clearing a path through the drifted snow between the cabin and the shed. He tossed a couple of emergency flares into his bag, along with a canteen of warm water and a few strips of salted meat. It wasn't the ideal meal for a bear, but it might at least buy him their trust. Trust. The word rang hollow in his mind. Could a starving, exhausted bear even comprehend trust? Would she see his gesture as an offering or as a threat? The wind howled louder as Ethan pulled on his thickest coat, the worn fabric stiff with frost from years of hard use. He strapped his knife to his belt and slung the rifle over his shoulder, not as a weapon, but as a last resort. He wasn't here to hurt them. He just wanted to help. The moment he stepped outside, the storm slammed into him with full force. The cold cut through his layers like shards of glass, and the wind threatened to knock him off balance. Snow swirled in blinding flurries, reducing visibility to just a few feet. His breath came in ragged gasps as he trudged toward the faint shapes of the bears. The mother bear spotted him immediately. Even through the storm, her eyes locked onto his, dark and piercing. She rose slightly on her haunches, her massive frame swaying as she let out a low guttural growl. Ethan froze, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from his chest. He raised his hands slowly, palms open, showing her he meant no harm. "It's okay," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the wind. "I'm not here to hurt you." The bear held his gaze for what felt like an eternity, her breath coming in heavy, labored puffs. Ethan could see the desperation in her movements, the way her body trembled with exhaustion. The cubs were barely moving now, their small forms huddled together in the snow. Ethan took a cautious step forward, then another. The mother bear didn't retreat, but she didn't charge either. Her growl faded into a low whine, almost as if she were pleading for help. Taking it as a tentative sign of trust, Ethan knelt a few feet away, carefully pulling a blanket from his bag. The cubs barely reacted as he draped it over their fragile bodies, their fur stiff with ice. The mother let out a short warning grunt as he moved closer, but she didn't intervene. Ethan worked quickly, placing another blanket over the second cub before scattering a few pieces of salted meat on the ground. He backed away slowly, gesturing toward the storage room he had prepared. "Come on," he murmured, his voice steady but low. "It's safe. Warm. Just follow me." The mother bear hesitated, sniffing the air cautiously. For a moment, Ethan thought she might turn and leave, retreating into the storm. But then she took a tentative step forward, nudging one of the cubs to follow. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he watched her approach, her movements slow and labored. He kept his distance, leading the way to the storage room with small, deliberate steps. Each time he looked back, the mother bear was closer, her cubs stumbling along behind her. When they finally reached the shed, Ethan opened the door wide and stepped aside, giving the bears space to enter. The mother bear hesitated at the threshold, sniffing the air again. She glanced at Ethan one last time, her dark eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place: fear, gratitude, or maybe just sheer exhaustion. Then, with a soft huff, she nudged her cubs inside and followed. Ethan closed the door gently behind them, securing the latch. He leaned against the wall, his chest heaving, the adrenaline finally catching up to him. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside that tiny shed there was warmth, safety, and maybe, just maybe, a chance for survival. The mother bear moved slowly, each step an enormous effort as she guided her cubs into the storage room. Ethan stood a few feet away, holding his breath. He had left the door wide open, hoping the space would feel less threatening. Snowflakes swirled in, the wind howling like a living thing, but the bears pressed on, their need for shelter outweighing their fear of the unknown. The cubs stumbled over the threshold, collapsing onto the blankets Ethan had laid out earlier. The mother bear followed, her massive frame brushing against the doorway as she entered. She turned to glance at Ethan one last time before huffing a deep breath and curling herself protectively around her cubs. Ethan exhaled slowly, his chest tight with relief and lingering anxiety. He stepped forward cautiously, pulling the door shut and securing the latch with steady hands. A wave of exhaustion washed over him as he leaned against the outer wall, the storm's fury raging around him. Inside, he could hear the soft sounds of the bears settling in, the cubs' faint whimpers and the mother's low, rhythmic breathing as she drew them closer to her warmth. Back in the cabin, Ethan lit his lantern and paced the room. His thoughts churned with a mix of exhilaration and fear. He had done it. He had helped them. But now came the hardest part, keeping them alive. From a small, frost-covered window in the storage room, Ethan watched the bears through the swirling snow. The cubs were motionless at first, buried beneath the blankets he had left for them. The mother bear lay with her head resting on her paws, her eyes half closed but alert. She shifted occasionally, her massive body a shield against the icy cold. Ethan stayed for hours, his breath fogging up the glass as he monitored their every movement. The first night passed in silence, the storm pounding relentlessly against the cabin and storage room. Ethan didn't sleep. Instead, he prepared small offerings of food and water, waiting for moments when the bears seemed at ease. Late in the night, when the mother bear appeared to doze, he crept to the storage room door and placed a tray of water and a few strips of dried meat just inside. Then he retreated, heart racing, and watched from the window. The next morning, the food and water were gone. The cubs began to stir on the second day, their movements tentative but encouraging. Ethan watched as one of them clumsily pawed at the blankets, burrowing deeper into their warmth. The mother bear, though still weary, seemed more relaxed. Her ears twitched at the sound of Ethan's footsteps outside, but she didn't growl or charge the door. Instead, she focused on her cubs, nudging them gently when they tried to stand on shaky legs. By the third day, the transformation was undeniable. The cubs were moving more freely, their tiny bodies no longer trembling. Ethan caught glimpses of them through the window, their curiosity rekindled as they nudged each other and batted at stray pieces of cloth. The mother bear remained vigilant, her eyes following their every move. But there was something different about her gaze now, less desperate, more calm. Ethan's role became a careful balancing act. Each time he left food or water, he moved slowly, ensuring the mother bear could hear him approach. She never lunged or growled, though her dark eyes watched him intently. He spoke to her in a soft voice, his words more for his own reassurance than hers. "It's okay," he would murmur, setting down the supplies. "I just want to help." Every interaction felt like a fragile truce, a delicate dance between trust and survival. Ethan knew the risks. One wrong move, one misstep, could shatter the tenuous bond they had formed. But as he watched the bears recover, the cubs growing stronger and the mother bear regaining her dignity, he couldn't help but feel a profound sense of connection. Sitting by his fire late one evening, Ethan found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. For years, he had clung to the belief that humans should never interfere with nature, that survival in the wild was a test only the strong could pass. But now, watching the bears reclaim their strength, he felt that belief begin to crumble. The mother bear's determination, her refusal to give up on her cubs even in the face of impossible odds, was nothing short of inspiring. It reminded him of humanity's own struggles, of the way people came together in moments of crisis, extending a hand when it mattered most. Survival, Ethan realized, wasn't always about standing apart. Sometimes it meant stepping in, taking a risk, offering compassion, and choosing to help, even when every instinct told you to stay away. Outside, the storm was finally dying down, the wind's howl fading into a distant whisper. Ethan gazed out the window, his eyes fixed on the small storage room where the bears rested. For the first time in years, he felt something stir within him, a sense of purpose, of connection, of belonging to something greater than himself. And as the first light of dawn broke through the clouds, Ethan knew he had made the right choice. On the fourth morning, Ethan awoke to an eerie stillness. The wind that had howled relentlessly for days was gone, replaced by a quiet so profound it seemed to envelop everything. He opened his cabin door cautiously, stepping outside into a world transformed. The storm had left behind a pristine, snow-covered landscape, the trees heavy with frost and the ground glistening under the soft morning light. The air was sharp and bitterly cold, but it carried a calm that had been absent for days. Ethan stood for a moment, taking it all in. The storm had passed, but its weight still lingered in his chest, a mix of exhaustion and relief. His gaze shifted to the storage room, where the bears had taken refuge. Over the past 3 days, he had watched them grow stronger, the cubs finding their feet again, and the mother bear regaining her strength. Now the time had come for them to leave. As if sensing the shift in the air, the mother bear began to stir. From the small window, Ethan saw her rise slowly, stretching her massive frame. The cubs clambered over her, playful and full of energy, their tiny growls and nips at each other a far cry from the fragile creatures he had first seen. The mother bear sniffed the air, her instincts calling her back to the wild. She turned to the door, her movements purposeful and deliberate. Ethan felt a pang of sadness as he prepared himself for what came next. He bundled up, grabbing his gloves and coat, and approached the storage room. Each step through the snow felt heavier than the last, as though the quiet farewell ahead carried its own gravity. Standing at the door, he hesitated for a moment before unlatching it and pulling it open. The sharp crack of the latch echoed in the stillness, and the bears immediately turned to look at him. The mother bear's eyes locked onto his, dark and steady, as if assessing him one last time. Ethan stepped back slowly, giving her the space she needed. His breath hung in the air, visible and fleeting, as he watched her nudge the cubs forward. One by one, they emerged into the snow, their small paws sinking into the powdery white as they followed her lead. The mother bear stepped out last, her massive frame silhouetted against the snow-drenched trees. Ethan stood a safe distance away, his rifle slung over his shoulder but untouched. He had no intention of using it. The mother bear turned her head toward him, her gaze soft but piercing. In that moment, the air seemed to hum with a quiet understanding, a connection that transcended words or instincts. It wasn't gratitude exactly, but something deeper, a recognition, an acknowledgement of what they had endured together. Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat, his chest tightening with an emotion he couldn't quite name. The cubs paused at the edge of the clearing, tumbling over one another in the snow as they waited for their mother. The mother bear gave Ethan one last look, her eyes meeting his for a heartbeat that stretched endlessly. Then, with a low, rumbling huff, she turned and began leading her cubs toward the dense forest. Ethan stood rooted in place, watching as their forms grew smaller and smaller, blending into the shadows of the trees until they were gone. For a long time, Ethan didn't move. The silence of the forest enveloped him, broken only by the occasional creak of snow-laden branches. The events of the past few days played over in his mind. The desperation of the bears, the storm's unrelenting fury, and the fragile bond that had formed between man and beast. He thought about the rules he had lived by for years, the unspoken code of non-interference that had governed his life in the wilderness. And yet, here he stood, his heart fuller than it had been in a long time. The bears' resilience, their unyielding fight to survive, had stirred something in him. They had reminded him that survival wasn't just about strength or skill. It was about connection. In the face of the storm, their shared struggle had bridged the divide between human and animal, teaching him a lesson he hadn't realized he needed to learn. Compassion, he now understood, wasn't a weakness. It was a form of strength, one that could transcend even the harshest of landscapes. Ethan turned back toward the cabin, his breath coming in slow, steady puffs that dissipated into the frigid air. The storm had tested him, not just physically but emotionally, forcing him to confront the boundaries he had built around himself. He had lived in solitude for years, believing he could separate himself from the world, from its struggles and its pain. But the bears had shown him otherwise. In their fight to survive, they had drawn him back into the fold of life, reminding him that he was part of something much larger than himself. As he stepped inside, closing the door against the cold, Ethan felt a quiet resolve settle over him. The wilderness was still harsh, still unforgiving, but it had also revealed its heart, a bond of survival that connected all living things. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt like he truly belonged. The storm had passed, but its impact lingered. For Ethan, Those 4 days were more than a fight for survival. They were a reckoning. He had come to Alaska seeking solitude, believing he could live apart from the chaos of the world. Yet, in those fleeting moments with the mother bear and her cubs, he had found something he hadn't known he was missing: connection. It was a silent, unspoken bond, forged in the face of the wilderness's brutal indifference. The bears had reminded him of something primal and universal, that even in the harshest conditions, empathy could transcend fear and break down the invisible walls between species. For weeks after the storm, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about them. The image of the cubs, frail and trembling, transformed into playful bundles of energy, stayed with him. He found himself scanning the tree line during his daily routines, hoping for a glimpse of them but knowing they were likely miles away, roaming deeper into the wilderness. And that was how it should be. He had offered them a moment of refuge, but they didn't belong to him. They belonged to the wild, as untamed and free as the mountains that surrounded him. Over the years, Ethan occasionally spotted bears in the distance. Sometimes it was just a fleeting shadow moving between the trees, other times a faint growl carried by the wind. Once, while foraging for berries near a frozen stream, he saw a mother bear with 2 grown cubs trailing behind her. His breath caught in his throat as he crouched low, watching from afar. Could it be them? The mother moved with the same steady grace, her cubs bounding through the snow with a playfulness that tugged at his heart. He stayed perfectly still, making no effort to approach, knowing that some moments weren't meant to be interrupted. He never reached for his camera, though he kept it tucked away in a corner of his cabin, its once prized lens gathering dust. He no longer felt the need to capture every encounter, every fleeting moment in nature. Some memories, he had learned, were best preserved in the heart, free from the constraints of a photograph. The bears were more than a story to tell or an image to frame. They were a reminder of something profound. The experience had reshaped Ethan's understanding of survival. It wasn't just about enduring the elements or mastering the art of self-reliance. It was about recognizing the shared struggle of all living beings, the delicate thread that connected every creature braving the wild. The mother bear's unyielding fight for her cubs, her willingness to trust him even for a moment, had taught him that compassion wasn't a weakness. It was a strength, a force capable of bridging even the widest chasms. On quiet evenings, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky burned with hues of orange and purple, Ethan often found himself gazing toward the forest. He would wonder if the bears were out there, thriving in the wilderness they called home. Maybe they had long forgotten the strange human who had offered them shelter during the storm, or maybe, in some small way, they remembered. It didn't matter. What mattered was the lesson they had left behind, a reminder that even in isolation no one is truly alone. As the seasons turned and the wilderness continued its eternal rhythm, Ethan felt a peace he hadn't known before. The storm had changed him, not by breaking him, but by softening him, opening his heart to the beauty and fragility of life in all its forms. And while the bears had disappeared into the forest, they remained with him in a way no photograph ever could, etched into his soul, a part of the wild that had become a part of him.